All right, now that the template has been created inside our Photoshop file, we're finally ready to get adding in some design elements. And there's a couple of cool things that I want to show you here, and we'll get into a little bit of Photoshop typography in just a little bit and a couple other cool things. But the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go and open up one of our sample files, which we will use as our layout's background. So go ahead and choose File, Open, or here on the Mac, I'm going to hit Command O, or if you're on the PC side, you could hit Control O. Head into your project files folder and look for a file called clouds.jpg. That's the fella that we're after. Go ahead and pop him open. Now, essentially what I want to do is I want to take this file and drag and drop it into the template that you and I have created. So there's a couple of different ways to do this, but I think probably the easiest way here is I'm going to head up to this drop-down menu here, Arrange Documents. And I'm simply going to choose Float All in Windows, and now we get something like this. We have one image open on top of the other. That's kind of the idea here. Oh, and one other thing that I should do here as well, just to make sure. I'm going to go back to my design template and make sure that you have your topmost layers selected. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to head back into the clouds. I have my Move tool selected inside Photoshop's toolbox. If you don't, go ahead and hit the V key on your keyboard to flip back to the Move tool. And quite literally, all I'm going to do is simply click and drag in the clouds and drop over top of my design template. Something like this. That's all there is to it. Okay, I'm going to head back to clouds. I'm going to close him. We don't need him anymore. Command W or Control W on the PC side is just fine there. And then what I'll do is I'll head back to this drop-down menu on the options bar there, the Arrange Documents, and I'm going to choose this first option here, Consolidate All, and that basically brings us back to where we were. All right, so now we have some clouds, which is looking fabulous here, but it's not large enough to fit inside our CD label or our DVD label, so we'll have to fix that. And the other thing, too, is that obviously it's covering up our template as well. So let's try and deal with some of these issues here. I'm going to show you something inside Photoshop called a clipping mask. I don't know if you've messed around with clipping masks before or not. They are definitely cool. So what I'm going to do is inside the Layers palette, the first order of business is to rename the layer. I always try and remember to rename my layers. Otherwise, you wind up with, layer 12, layer 13, layer 14, and you're going, where are the clouds? I'm trying to find the clouds. So I always try and rename my layers, and I use very simple names, as you've already been able to tell. So I'm just going to call this clouds. There we are. I'm going to take my clouds layer and drag him all the way down in my list of layers until he's just above the disk layer. So in other words, I can see all of my circles now sitting on top of the clouds. That's just fine. Now, the issue of clipping masks. If you've never used them before, essentially how I want this to work is I want the layer below, in this case the disk layer, to act as a cookie cutter, if you will. And essentially what I want it to do is I want it to mask away areas that appear in the layer above, right? So in other words, any area that falls outside of the disk, I want to be clipped or masked on the clouds layer. If that doesn't really make sense, essentially the idea here is that the disk layer is the cookie cutter and the clouds layer is the dough, if you will. So here's the idea. Here's what I'm going to do. It's actually very simple to pull this off. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the Option key here on the Mac or hold down the Alt key on the Windows side. And all I'm going to do is bring my cursor between the two layers. And you get this really weird, funky looking icon there, kind of the double circle there with a small triangle. When you see this icon, go ahead and single click. That icon indicates that we're about to create a clipping mask. Go ahead and click there. And now what happens is the clouds layer is now indented. It's now a clipping mask. It's now a part of the disk and clouds clipping mask group, if you will. Disk is now underlined, indicating that it is now the cookie cutter, and it's masking away areas of the clouds that fall outside of the disk. Very cool stuff. I use these guys all the time. Now, the interesting thing to point out is that the clouds that fall outside of the disk are not deleted. They're still there. They're just hidden. They're masked, right? So with my Move tool still selected, and I still have the clouds layer selected, Now, essentially, I can move the clouds around. It's like the disk is now like a little window almost, right? And I can move and position the cloud layer around and set this up however I want. If you think this is cool, try setting up a clipping mask using text. That's where you can put a picture inside characters. Very cool stuff. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use my free transform, Command T or Control T, and I'll just hold down my Shift key, and I'm going to scale my clouds just a little bit larger so that they essentially fill in the rest of the disk. Something like this. And maybe I'll position things up here, something like this. Hit enter to lock in those changes. All right, wonderful. So we have a background graphic now inside our Photoshop file. We have a clipping mask happening as well. And you know, the other thing that I'm going to do here is a few of our layers we're actually not going to use just yet. The circle 1 layer and the circle 2 layer. I'm going to turn those guys off. In older CD and DVD templates, we'd have these extra circles, these extra rings, which you probably remember. But newer templates usually just have the hole. That's because printing technology has gotten so good it can actually print all the way to the hole in the disk. So that's what I'm headed for.